You're watching CNN. I'm Julia Chatterley in New York. And we begin with the fight for Mariupol. Russia says over 1,000 Ukrainian Marines that were defending the besieged port city have now surrendered. However, Ukraine is saying that its remaining troops in the city have now managed to combine forces. And a video statement posted Tuesday by a member of the Marine unit said that they would hold until the end. Quote, "We need to point out CNN is not in Mariupol and cannot independently confirm any of these details." Meanwhile, Ukraine's offering Russia a prisoner exchange. President Zelensky says he's willing to turn over Viktor Medvedchuk, the pro-Moscow Ukrainian politician who was detained this week. In return, he's demanding the release of Ukrainian prisoners of war. So far, no response from the Kremlin, which is accused of committing war crimes by France. Yet President Macron stopping short of using the word genocide. President Biden, however, willing to go further. Late Tuesday, he accused Vladimir Putin of trying to wipe out even the idea of a Ukrainian identity. As the Russian leader says peace talks are at a dead end, new satellite images show Russian forces moving east for what's expected to be a major offensive. And CNN teams reporting shelling of residential areas too in Kharkiv. There's new video of what looks like explosions caused by cluster munitions. Their use against civilian targets may amount to war crimes, according to the UN. And earlier Wednesday, President Zelensky accusing Russia of using incendiary phosphorus weapons to try and terrorize the Ukrainian people.
Strikes. The residential compounds were decimated by all sorts of rockets and bombs and artillery, in particular the phosphorus bombs and some others bound by international law. This is obvious terror against the civilian population. This is a try to break the spirit of the nation, to conquer the Ukrainians, or simply annihilate them.
Fred Pleitgen is in Kyiv for us now. Fred, I want to start by talking about reports from Mariupol. The Ukrainians are saying that their remaining forces there have consolidated and are now working together, but the hold feels increasingly fragile.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It does feel increasingly fragile, but I think one of the other things that we have to keep in mind that it's pretty much a miracle that those Ukrainian soldiers are still actually holding on to Mariupol, or actually managing to hold on to a part of Mariupol. It's obviously a city that has been encircled from the very first days of this war, where the Russians have been moving in, and it's absolutely impossible to get any new supplies into that area. And what happened during the course of the fighting, as more and more Russian forces poured into Mariupol, is that the defenders of Mariupol, they were essentially separated from one another. So the Russians managed to drive a wedge between them, move their own forces in there. And now it seems as though, from what the Ukrainians are saying, that those forces have managed to link up, that some of the Marine brigades that the Ukrainian military had in there, they managed to link up with some of the other defenders, while it seems as though, from what the Russians are saying, some of the other Marines were then taken prisoner by the Russians. So it seems as though, on the whole, there are fewer Ukrainian forces that are still defending that city, but they have managed to consolidate their position. Of course, they've also acknowledged that they believe that they're not going to be able to hold that position for much longer, because they are so low on supplies, and because, of course, the Russians have moved so many forces in there. We can see on our screens there some of the destruction in Mariupol. Of course, it is one of the most destroyed city, probably the most destroyed city currently in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government says that tens of thousands of people may have been killed in the fighting. Of course, many others also displaced, but many civilians apparently also still in that city, as well as the fighting there certainly does seem to continue, Julia.
And Fred, you know better than most, I think it's hard to look at the scenes that we're seeing there and not respond with an emotional rather than a technical response, as perhaps President Biden did yesterday, and call it genocide. French President Emmanuel Macron not willing to go there, but you were one of the first journalists into Bucha yourself. You've seen evidence of what was left behind, and I know you've also spent time now with the investigators that are collecting evidence of so-called war crimes. Talk us through those experiences, Fred.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the most interesting things yesterday that President Biden said is that he believes that this is something that's increasingly amounting to genocide, but he has to wait and to see what the lawyers are going to say. And what the Ukrainians have done is they've launched a massive investigation into war crimes, into crimes against humanity, and now also into possible genocide as well. And I was able to link up with the chief prosecutor who's leading this charge, and who also, by the way, says that she really needs to do her best to distance herself emotionally from all this and to make this fundamental, objective, investigative work. And we conducted our interview right at the main mass grave there in Bucha, which is obviously a grim place. And so we do have to warn our viewers that some of what you're about to see is graphic and disturbing. Have a look.
Even as Russian troops mass in eastern Ukraine for what the U.S. believes will be a huge offensive, authorities in Kiev continue digging up bodies. Painstaking work that goes hand in hand with investigating Russia's attack on Kiev and possible crimes committed by Vladimir Putin's invading troops. Prosecutor General Irina Venediktova is leading the charge. She spoke to me at the edge of a mass grave in the Kiev suburb of Bucha.
For us, the best motivation is justice. And of course, we understand that all Ukrainians want fast justice, true and fast justice. That's why we do everything to document all evidence, all facts of war crimes that we have here in Ukraine.
French forensic investigators are now also on the scene, not because Ukraine lacks expertise, but because Kiev wants to be as transparent as possible in the face of Russian disinformation efforts.
We want to do our job absolutely open with standards of international humanitarian law. It's very high standards. That's why when here we have our international colleagues, we understand that they can see everything. They can see a real situation here, real graves, real dead bodies.
After Ukrainian forces managed to expel Russian troops from around Kiev and some other areas they'd occupied in Ukraine, authorities have discovered scores of dead bodies. Today, another 6 found in just one basement outside Kiev. The prosecutor tells me they are collecting evidence in thousands of cases.
Now we started more than 6,000 cases. It's crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression crimes. And we started on the first days of war, we started the case about genocide.
All this as Russia still claims its forces that invaded Ukraine have not harmed any civilians. On a visit to a spaceport with Belarusian strongman Alexander Lukashenko, Russian President Vladimir Putin again claimed his forces are fighting against would-be Ukrainian Nazis in what he calls a, quote, special operation. The goals are absolutely clear and they are noble, he said. I said it from the beginning and want to draw your attention to that.
There are some in the U.S. at the top level who have spoken about a possible war crimes trial against Vladimir Putin. Is that something you think could ever be possible, and it's something that you're working towards to provide evidence for?
Of course, I think that everyone understands who is responsible for this war. That's why we do everything to to document evidences. But we are here in Ukraine and actually understand who is responsible for all of this.
The investigators' work is complicated by the fact that the war is still going on, and they can't reach many devastated areas like the encircled city of Mariupol, where Ukraine's president says tens of thousands have been killed. But Irina Venediktova says no matter how long it takes, she will press on.
It's actually extremely important because if we will be successful as a prosecutors, I am sure that we can stop such aggressions in the future.
So there you have the general prosecutor, Julia, and just to give you an idea of what they're up against, they're obviously collecting this forensic evidence, but at the same time, of course, there is also that very large Russian disinformation campaign. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that the Russians have said, they've said that the corpses in Bucha are fake, which is obviously not the case. They've said that when their forces left that area, everybody was still alive and must have been killed by the Ukrainians, even though there's satellite images to prove otherwise, and drone footage, by the way, as well. And yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin, when he was at that spaceport with Alexander Lukashenko, he also said that he believed that all the images coming out of Bucha are absolutely fake. Julia?
Fred Plagin, thank you, as always, for that report. The upshot of all of this, two non-NATO members, Finland and Sweden, edging closer. In a press conference with the Swedish leader earlier today, Finland's Prime Minister discussed the possibility of applying for membership.
We need to have a consensus, we need to have a view on the future, and we are using this time to analyze and also building common views on the future when it comes to security. I won't give any kind of timetable when we will make our decisions, but I think it will happen quite fast, within weeks, not within months.
Nick Robertson joins us now. Nick, long-term partners, if not members of NATO, Finland and Sweden, perhaps deciding now that they no longer have the luxury of remaining on the fence where this body is concerned. How close do you think they are to that consensus that the Prime Minister was talking about there?
I think Finland's very close and Sweden's probably not far behind. And why do I say that? Speaking to a Finnish diplomat earlier this year before Russia's invasion, one of the big takeaways for Finland was just what NATO membership means and what Russia's aggression means. And, you know, to Finland sitting outside of NATO, although doing many military exercises, partnering with NATO in the past, sitting outside, they realized what Ukraine was going through was a scenario where a nation was being attacked by an aggressive neighbor, Russia, but that nation would have to face it alone, even if it aspired to be part of NATO, even if it shared values with other NATO countries, because it's only Article 5 that makes you safe. And we heard from both the Finnish Prime Minister today and the Swedish Prime Minister saying Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed everything. So if you go back to earlier this year when perhaps only a quarter of the population in Finland would have supported membership of NATO, the sense is that that's really changed. And what we've heard from the Finnish Prime Minister today is that after Easter, they'll give this 51-page discussion document to the Finnish Parliament. They will expect within weeks to have it concluded. And there's really an expectation here in Brussels and at NATO headquarters that by the time we get to the end of June and NATO's leadership summit, Finland will be asking, and potentially Sweden as well, will be asking to become a full member of NATO. And that is something that's expected to go through fairly easily and fairly swiftly. Everyone here has the sense that that's in motion. What does it mean for NATO? Significantly, it's going to double its land border with Russia when Finland joins. Finland has almost an 800-mile border with Russia. So there are significant consequences here.
Yes, consequences for NATO and for Russia. To your point, Nick, I feel if the Ukraine crisis can't convince you, perhaps nothing will. President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government unwilling to host the German president in Kyiv. A mistake, Nick? Whatever the concerns about his relationship with Russia, Ukraine continues and will continue to need Germany.
Yeah, President Zelensky and Ukraine's leadership have been really tough on people and countries that they feel are causing problems or making life difficult for them. We've heard them call in the early stages out President Biden, call out Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister. And here this feels and looks like a strange one. Walter Steinmeier, the German president, expected to accompany the Polish, Lithuanian, Estonian, Latvian presidents who went to who've gone to Kyiv today. Steinmeier was the foreign minister in Germany, and there seems to be a perception in Kyiv that as foreign minister in Germany previously, he was the one that was sort of responsible for forging closer ties with Russia, Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. But of course, Germany itself has done so much in recent days. It's the first country to take wounded Ukrainian civilians by plane and fly them to Germany for treatment. It's been treating wounded Ukrainian soldiers in Germany over past weeks. It was slow to offer military assistance, but it's made a massive and fundamental change in its approach to its own security, massively increasing its defense spending and shifting from a position of saying that it would only supply helmets to the Ukrainian forces, it's essentially signaled that the Czech Republic can provide M72 tanks to Ukraine that were once that had once belonged to East Germany. So yes, and we've heard from Germany's Chancellor today, Olaf Scholz, saying he's essentially disappointed. It's irksome, this decision by Ukraine to essentially say no thank you to the President of Germany going on a visit.
It's a huge shift in terms of sentiment across the EU, but as the Ukrainians keep arguing, it's still not enough. Nick Robertson, thank you for that. Vladimir Putin saying he will find alternative markets for Russia's coal, oil and gas in response to Western sanctions. Meanwhile, economists in Germany warn the country faces a sharp recession if Russian gas supplies are cut off, or they choose to cut them off, and the cost, $240 billion. Anna Stewart joins me now. Anna, very much tied to the conversation I was just having with Nick there. It's not just about the financial cost. The suggestion from this analysis too is the cost of 400,000 jobs. I wonder whether that perhaps gives Olaf Scholz the political cover to avoid an embargo.
Well, certainly this report just shows how expensive any kind of energy embargo would be. But what was actually also interesting was just the baseline scenario of no escalation in terms of the economics with Russia. And that already sees Germany's economy growing at just 2.7% this year. That is a big downgrade from 4.8%, which was the last estimate. And this year they see inflation coming in at above 6%. The other scenario, which really focused just on gas stopping, Russian gas stopping to Germany, they see GDP coming in at 1.9% this year and a contraction of 2.2% next year. $240 billion being wiped off the economy, hundreds of thousands of jobs. I think you're right. I think when you look at Germany and its resistance so far to any kind of embargo on Russian energy, this gives political cover because it would be hugely expensive to the economy, to the cost of living for everyday people, and hundreds of thousands of jobs on the line.
One of the best bosses I ever worked for used to say to me, don't come to me with problems of your own creation. Come to me with the solutions. I feel like that applies here. Anna, we'll come back to this. Thank you for that. Anna Stewart there. We're back after this. Stay with CNN. Welcome back. More than 4 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes and seek shelter in foreign countries since the start of the Russian invasion in February. Many of these people face the scary, uncertain prospect of building a new life in an unfamiliar land without friends or family for support. A global business network set up in 2016 to help Syrian and Afghan refugees is now lending its expertise to help Ukrainians in need. The Tent Partnership for Refugees comprises more than 200 large multinational firms who've pledged to hire, train and support refugees in the workplace. Tent Partnership is the brainchild of Hamdi Ulukaya. He's the CEO of Chobani, a US-based food company committed to helping the refugee community since its inception. At one point, around 30% of Chobani's employees were immigrants or refugees. Hamdi Ulukaya joins us now. He's just come back from a visit to the Polish-Ukrainian border. Hamdi, great to have you on the show. You've simply been at the arrival point for millions of Ukrainian refugees who've been forced to flee. What was your sense being there?
You know, it's the same picture that I saw when I was in the border of Venezuela and Colombia, or in the border of Turkey and Syria, or in an island of Greece. This is something that we've been talking about for years, this devastation, this human move without their will. It creates massive amount of tragedy. And I never thought, Juliet, one day I would be seeing this in the heart of Europe. And here we are in the border, same picture.
I saw one of the many conversations that you had, I'm sure, a mother who'd been forced to flee with her 6-month-old child. Can you tell us something about that conversation? I'm sure among many, but it stood out to me.
Yeah, so this was in a center where UNHCR set up this cash center, which is beautifully done. And I asked the people in that center, I said, how did this happen? And they said, we set this up in 1 week. And I'll come to the baby. What pleased me in that conversation in that center, Julie, is that they said, well, Hilton provided a place for us to train. Manpower provided the selection of the people who spoke Ukrainian. Uber provided the cars for the aid workers to come back and forth, and IKEA provided the furnitures. What pleased me is the companies, our member companies, are stepping up and playing major role, making this help to be provided. In there, you see women and children that on the line and trying to get registered, and so they can get some cash. It's very, very sensitive in that moment to be able to have a conversation, because you know where it's going to land, where it's going to go. Her daughter's name was Polina. She is 9 months old, a single mother, and she left. They left their dad behind, and of course, children are children. They're beautiful. They're innocent, wherever they are. Mother, you can tell her heart is filled with worries and uncertainty. What she wants to go back. What she wants to go back to her dad, and the mother wants to go back to her husband. The lady who was translating to me, she came to me after and said, I'm so glad that you didn't ask many hard questions. Even though she was translating for me, her family was also in Ukraine. And her dad doesn't want to leave the town that they lived, and they are on the eastern part of Ukraine. And what you see there is the translator or the mother with children or people who are helping. They're all going through the same emotions of what is going to happen today to my family. And of course, the biggest concern is what happened to my country.
I mean, you've described it there, and this is the power of what you've created in the Tent Partnership, which is these big companies at every stage of the process of being a refugee, just rebuilding your life in the first few days to rebuilding a future, getting the stability that a job provides, which I know is so powerful. to you. Just explain the tent partnership, because it's not just about Ukraine, it's been Afghan refugees and Syrian refugees, to your point too.
So Jill, this has happened when I started Chobani, in upstate New York. And when hired everyone in our local community after the factory was closed, I hit a little town called Utica, and they said there are refugees from all around the world settled here legally, and they're having a hard time finding a job. And when I asked the question, I said, what is the problem? And they said it's the language. They don't speak the language. They don't have the training, and they don't have driver license and cars to drive to the work. And I thought those were very simple problems to solve. We rented buses, we got translators, and we trained them inside our plants. At some point, we have 30% of our workforce refugees from 19 different countries, 16 different languages is spoken. And same thing happened in Idaho, but I never thought this was work for refugees. I thought this was a community work. People in the community, they're eager to work, they have right to work, and providing and removing some obstacles to be able to be part of a community. When the Syrian crisis happened, I went to Switzerland to meet with UNHCR. I went all the NGOs, and what I realized that the companies and CEOs and entrepreneurs are not involved is one of the most crucial humanitarian crises that we're facing today. Millions of people are in despair in camps and out of society, out of community, absolutely out of the workforce. And looking at my own experience and saying, the minute they get a job, that's the minute they stop being a refugee. I saw people, develop life for themselves, be part of community. And I saw in my own experience at Chobani how much they provide to my company. And I thought, starting 10th in 2016, with the idea of if companies provide jobs, training, helping them wherever they are, using their supply chain, that these people who are in stuck environment, through job, they can be unstuck. It was hard work in the beginning. Of course, I did not have a lot of companies wanted to come up and be part of this effort. But looking back now, over 200 companies, and looking at the border, the Ukrainian border, how companies are stepping up. And here, for the Afghani refugees or the incoming Ukrainian refugees, when we have the CEO, Council for Refugees, we have come a long way, and we still have a long way to go. But if I look at this particular refugee issue all around the globe, companies and CEOs have massive role to play. This is the only way we can make a difference.
I think your point there was crucial, that you don't stop being a refugee just because you've got somewhere safe. Actually, you become and stop being a refugee when you have some sense of stability, a home, a job, and can sort of make roots in the place where you've ended up. I want to ask you, because the ethos of your company too was about providing better quality food to those that need it. And what we're looking at now is a food crisis for some of the poorest parts in the world, and it's been dramatically exacerbated by the war in Ukraine because of their importance in certain agricultural products. Can I ask you what you're seeing, and how concerned are you by rising input prices, inflationary pressures, particularly in food?
This is such an important topic. Let's talk about food inside Ukraine. You're talking about 4 million people moved. They are in Poland. I have to tell you, Julie, these Polish people and the Romanians and Slovakians and Moldovians, the way that they reacted to their neighboring people's need is unbelievable. They are in their homes, welcomed. I don't see tents on the streets. I don't see camps on the streets. We have to point out that this is one of the most beautiful sights I have ever seen. Inside the Ukraine, there are more IDPs. And those people moved from the east side of the country or Kiev to the west, and that's creating a food insecurity. Now, globally, we know, a lot of food is produced in Russia and Ukraine for the world market. For some estimates, 30 million people, and some estimates some more, will be in the urge of hunger this year around the world, just simply because of rising prices or inability to get food, especially wheat and oil. So this is the biggest alarming food issue we're going to have in the recent history globally. We're going to talk about hunger or death from hunger if we don't react right now. And if you look at the World Food Program, they're taking the food from needed one to the starving ones, already started. So this is alarming. For the food pricing globally, especially on the West, I think we're going to see effects. We already see effects. I'm worried about the farmers. I was just upstate yesterday and talking to some of the farmers when it comes to fertilizers. I think the supply of fertilizer is there, price is high, and that is going to affect, the pricing furthermore. I think on the west side of the world, where we are in Europe and some other countries, we'll manage it through it. I'm not really worried, but I'm worried the most is people in need when it comes to Africa, Northern Africa and eastern part of the world where they need essential food and ability to get them.
Yeah, those are the nations that we need to support. Hamdi, great to have you on. Thank you for all the work that you and your partners are doing.
So much.
The CEO of Chobani and founder of the Tent Partnership for Refugees. Thank you, sir. We're back after this. Welcome back. Ukraine offering Russia a prisoner exchange. President Zelensky says he's willing to turn over Viktor Medvedchuk, the newly detained ally of Vladimir Putin. In return, he's demanding the release of Ukrainian prisoners of war. So far, the Kremlin has not responded. Meanwhile, military officials say a Russian missile strike damaged an apartment block in Donetsk, leaving 7 people injured. And as the war continues, talent is starting to leave Russia as sanctions make it harder to run an international business. One Moscow-based couple with family in Ukraine decided to get out just days after the invasion began. Nikita and Valentina Blanc are the founders of Hey Everyone, offering a way to automate investor communications. They began work while still in Russia, but say they were never planning to incorporate there. Nikita and Valentina Blanc join us now. Welcome to you both and thank you for joining the show. Nikita, talk to me first. The beauty of this day and age is that you can run an international business from anywhere because a lot of it's remote. But 3 days into the invasion, you decided you and your family had to leave Moscow. Talk to me about that decision. Why?
Julia, thanks for having us. Well, that was a very emotional decision. You know, at a certain point, we felt like we already hit the bottom. But, you know, each new day brought us something new in terms of bottoms. And we just thought that we can't, you know, run the business in a calm and safe place. So we decided to run it from somewhere else. And that, you know, that was important because that was the moment when we started running things.
And Valentina, it's personal for you because half of your family is Ukrainian. They're still there. It's on your father's side. How are your Ukrainian family doing?
Yeah, Julia, thank you for having us. My gut feeling is that we are going through a tough time. And human psyche, as you know, has three options: stand, fight, or run. And at first I felt like I'm frozen. There is uncertainty all over the place. You have no idea of what's going on. And my hopes of tensions fading evaporated soon. And so we decided to move on with our lives and move. And I'm half Ukrainian, and my relatives live in Ukraine. They're spread across different locations like Kharkiv, Kyiv, and others. And we also have our family house that we got from our great-grandmother. At some point, our relatives called and told us about this situation, and their city near Kyiv is being under military actions. Long story short, they went hiding to our family house and took their friends and sisters, the youngest of them, by the way, 3 years older, like my daughter. Yeah, and all of the 25 people were hiding.
Pretty terrifying.
In the house.
Pretty terrifying for you. I can hear it in your voice. Nikita, what about the family that you left in Russia? What are they saying to you about what they think's going on? Do they understand?
Well, you can't blame people for being in a certain informational bubble. So, like, older generations, they tend to watch TV, and due to the fact that all of the independent media was simply blocked in the country, the only source of information is, you understand. So, like, this is their source of information. This is how they understand things. And they're not really able to read Western media. They're not able to read Ukrainian media as well, or any independent media. So communication-wise, it's like a tough call. But you know, we're trying to find our common spots and talk about things that we both love. And you know, right now, the most important thing for all of us is that everyone stays safe, and you know, there's no military reactions. That's the most important thing.
Do you think you'll ever go back to Moscow, Nikita? Because as you said, you were looking to incorporate your company in the United States anyway. Is it possible to build a thriving digital or tech company in Russia even before this? Does it feel pretty impossible now, given all the economic constraints and the political constraints too, let's be clear?
Yeah, well, you know that it's not our first company that we're doing, right? And previously we had another company that we were building that was called Challenge App. We were actually #4 top popular app in the United States back in 2020. Funny enough, after we left Taiwan in 2017, we were running that company from Russia. And despite of the fact that our team was totally decentralized, we were like spread across the world, including United States, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Thailand, and other countries. That didn't feel impossible that we could run an international business, because that was a very, very, very cool place to live. But right now, what I'm hearing from VCs, and currently we're building mostly a US-based company because we're starting with US clients. So we're fundraising in the US. What I'm hearing is that they don't want to, have anything attached to Russia in their portfolio. And this is totally understandable. You couldn't expect a US-based VC to invest into a Russian-based company. That never happened before. I never heard about this before. So to us, it's not something new. It's just that we physically have to be someplace else.
Yeah, because it's become so toxic to have anything to do with Russia or Russian investment of any kind. We're going to continue this conversation about your business, which is fascinating in of itself, but I do want to talk about your family, because you have a beautiful daughter, Eva. You're now in Georgia. I'm sure in the beginning, as I've heard from many Russians around the world, they were afraid perhaps of what the reception would be. How has the reception been to you there? And she's absolutely beautiful, by the way. We've got some other pictures of her too.
Thank you. Well,
Thank you.
reception, I don't know. I don't really know what to say. Georgia is one of the most welcoming countries.
Yeah, there was a really warm welcome for us.
Super warm. Yeah, because we do have relatives here in Georgia as well, and we're not to say that we're famous, but local people do know us, and they understand that we're totally international folks, that we have nothing to do with the situation that goes on right now. And we, however, understand that people are concerned about the way things are, and so we're not trying to be pushy or anything. We're just trying to be super friendly to everyone. And yeah, we're also very, very thankful and grateful for people being so welcome and supportive.
And by the way, a lot of international entrepreneurs, they help local people to work, and they make some startups like we made with the local people, and try to help them.
Yeah, we actually managed to make another startup here in Georgia.
Guys, it's good to see a happy story amongst a lot of sadness. And Valentina, our hearts are with your family. We pray they stay safe. Guys, we'll talk again soon. Nikita and Valentina Blanc there. Thank you, guys. We're back after this.
Thank you.
Welcome back with a look at some of the stories making headlines around the world. A massive manhunt is underway to find a person who shot 10 people on a New York City subway on Tuesday morning. The shooter set off a smoke grenade and opened fire amid the confusion that followed. Police have identified a 62-year-old suspect who had posted videos online talking about mass shootings. Joining us now from Brooklyn is CNN's Jason Carroll. Jason, the key word change there, I believe, is suspect now rather than a person of interest. What more do we know about the manhunt?
Well, you are absolutely right. It was just a few hours ago this morning when folks in New York City woke up. Frank James, 62 years old, was identified as a person of interest. The NYPD, New York City Police Department, changed the language on that within the past hour. He is now being named as a suspect, and that he is the man responsible for the shooting which occurred out here yesterday. Investigators say they found several key items that were linked to Frank James, including keys to a rental U-Haul van. That U-Haul van found not too far from where I'm standing right now. That U-Haul van rented in Philadelphia. Apparently James has addresses in not only Philadelphia, Julia, but also Wisconsin as well. Investigators also taking a very close look at James' social media. Some of the things that he posted, disturbing videos that he posted on YouTube, for example, on Monday, just one day before the shooting, where he talked about wanting to kill people. In earlier social media posts, he talked about violence, he talked about mass shootings, the homelessness population here in New York City, and also mentioned New York City Mayor Eric Adams by name. Eric Adams speaking to CNN, saying that social media companies need to do more to protect the public.
You look at how we're using social media right now to put threats out there, carry out dangerous actions, and there are clear correlations between what's being posted and what's being carried out in our streets, in this case and in many other cases. Part of the job is receiving threats. I get threats from time to time, not only in the role as the mayor, as a state senator, as the borough president, even as a police officer. I have a great deal of confidence in the law enforcement officers that are around me.
Again, at this point, in terms of the investigation, Eric Adams saying that police are still following up on a number of leads. The U.S. Marshals has joined the manhunt for Frank James, along with the NYPD, the FBI, as well as the ATF, and as well as a number of other agencies as well. And again, Frank James, no longer a person of interest. He is now officially the suspect. Julia?
Jason Carroll, great to have you with us. Thank you. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has apologised for breaching a COVID lockdown in 2020 when he attended a Downing Street gathering. He says he's paid a £50 fine imposed by the police, but he wouldn't say if he would resign for breaking the rules. We're back after this. Stay with us. Welcome back. US banking giant JP Morgan said today its profits fell more than 40% in the first quarter as the war in Ukraine pressured global business. The results came in weaker than Wall Street had expected. CEO Jamie Dimon warning that he sees, quote, significant challenges for the US economy due to the war, as well as the effects of stressed supply chains and persistently high inflation. US stocks, meanwhile, moving, as you can see, higher in the trading session, even after the release of another red-hot inflation number. Prices at the factory gate rising by more than 11% year over year in March. That's the sharpest monthly jump on record, bucking that trend, as you can see, the handover from Europe, where stocks are lower. The Zetrodax, the underperformer. Now, the fight against misinformation, pro-Russian sentiment is being exposed online in China. A number of images from popular social media sites in China have been translated and posted on Twitter, including a prominent military blog falsely claiming the Russian attack on a train station in Kramatorsk was carried out by Ukraine. The anonymous translators say their goal is to raise awareness about the true state of public opinion in China. David Culver joins us on this. Public opinion in China or government opinion in China? David, we can debate this. The message from the anonymous Twitter expose account suggesting that China's not neutral in this war.
Right, and I think if you're trying to get an idea as to where the Chinese public sits with all of this, Julia, I mean, you have to realize it's heavily nuanced because, I mean, certainly state media echoes the Kremlin, and they've been doing that now for some time, simply regurgitating a lot of the propaganda that's come out of Russia and putting it into the airwaves here. But anecdotally, folks you talk with, they stand on all different sides of this. However, more recently, I can tell you it's been overtaken by the massive COVID surge that folks have been dealing with here, so they're not as focused on it. Nonetheless, this is an interesting case that we're looking at here. I mean, Western audiences getting this rare glimpse into the Chinese internet as anonymous Twitter users are exposing that nationalism, that pro-Russian sentiment that has been circulating online here. And so they're using these screen-grabbed posts from China's most popular social media platforms, translating them, and then putting them on Twitter, which, as we well know, is banned here in China. Among those posts, you mentioned one of them, a prominent military blog, falsely claiming that the Russian attack on the train station was actually carried out by Ukraine. There's also one with a well-known media commentator dismissing the atrocities in Bucha. And there's a post from a vlogger with hundreds of thousands of followers using a misogynistic term for Ukraine. So who's behind it? Well, the posts appear courtesy of anonymous Twitter users. They say their aim is to expose the Western audiences to this true extent of pro-Russian or nationalistic content on China's heavily censored platforms. The posts often come under the hashtag the Great Translation Movement. An administrator behind some of the posts tells CNN that the movement was a response of sorts to China's alleged hypocrisy and portrayed itself as neutral on Ukraine, even while Chinese state media and social media circulated all these pro-Russian narratives. All of this is not going over well with Beijing. China's state media has lashed out against what it considers to be cherry-picked content. Now, outside China, you've got media experts who warn the posts don't really show a holistic view of public opinion in China, but could still be useful in shining a light on these elements of China's media sphere. The Great Translation Movement administrator said that they hoped the movement could help push Beijing to really just tone down the rhetoric on these platforms, Julia, so that there would be, in their view, more room for more voices.
Yeah, but David, within that, and thank you for that report, is a very important point, which is the focus on COVID and the lockdowns and the challenges the country faces on that is also a dominating factor on social media too.
Right.
David Culver, yeah, thank you for that. Now, and finally, a monster comet is heading our way, but thankfully it won't come close enough to hit Earth. NASA's Hubble telescope spotted this giant flying through space. It's about 100,000 times greater than the mass of a typical comet. It will be nearest to the Earth by 2031. Yes, you heard me right. But NASA defines near as about 1.6 billion kilometers away, which is just shy of 1 billion miles. So we're not worrying just yet. Thank goodness for that. That's it for the show. Stay with CNN. Connect the World with Becky Anderson is next, and I'll see you tomorrow.
I'm Becky Anderson coming to you live from London. Hello and welcome to Connect the World. Today on the show, an exclusive interview with the Austrian Chancellor after his face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Monday. Why he believes we are at a, quote, dangerous moment in Russia's war on Ukraine. And next hour, I'll speak to Italy's foreign minister about the impact of the invasion on the people of his country as costs soar amid talk of further Russian energy sanctions. Plus, Pakistan's new Prime Minister, now on the job, will go live to Islamabad to speak to the head of one of the parties that put Shehbaz Sharif in power about what to expect next. We begin this hour in eastern Ukraine, where Russia is redeploying forces and ramping up attacks amid a new military phase of this brutal war. At least 7 people were wounded when a missile strike damaged an apartment block in the Donetsk region. The military governor there says Russia's main tactic now is to kill and terrorize civilians. And we have new video of what appears to be cluster munitions in a civilian area of Kharkiv. You can see at least 4 explosions just seconds apart, spanning about 90 meters. The UN has said that such attacks in populated areas may amount to war crimes. Meanwhile, a major escalation in rhetoric by the US president. For the first time on Tuesday, Joe Biden described the atrocities committed by Russian troops in Ukraine as genocide, a designation he had previously avoided. Take a listen.
I called it genocide because it's become clearer and clearer that Putin is just trying to wipe out the idea of even being able to be a Ukrainian. And the evidence is mounting. We'll let the lawyers decide internationally whether or not it qualifies, but it sure seems that way to me.
Well, Ukraine's president later thanked Mr. Biden, tweeting, quote, calling things by their names is essentially to stand up to evil. Not all of Ukraine's allies approve of that rhetoric. French President Emmanuel Macron rejected the use of the term genocide, saying it won't help stop the war. And right now, the presidents of Poland and the Baltic states are on their way to Kyiv to meet with Volodymyr Zelensky. They plan to discuss the investigation into war crimes and getting aid to Ukraine's civilians. Well, the Chancellor of Austria visited the region recently to see the devastation firsthand. Chancellor Karl Nehammer stopped at the Ukrainian town of Bucha, where authorities say hundreds of bodies are being found. Well, afterwards, he met with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. I spoke with Mr. Nehammer a short time ago and asked him why it was so important to talk with the Russian president in person and what he thought of Vladimir Putin's mindset. Have a listen.
First of all, my first trip was to Ukraine to meet President Zelensky and Prime Minister there, to visit Bucha. You know, this is the village where we could see a mass grave. We talked there to the priest, and he informed us that the people in this mass grave were murdered by Russian soldiers. And afterwards, I did a decision to go to Moscow to look in President Putin's eyes and confront him with that what I saw, the war crimes, the loss of Russian soldiers and Russian army, the need to stop the war, and the clear message that the war has to end.
How was Vladimir Putin's demeanor in your meeting? How do you read his mindset at present?
Well, he was very clear in his messages. In his point of view, he has to defend the Russian Federation, the Russians living in the eastern Ukraine. I think we will see that the war will go on. He was clear in his messages. He is in his own logic about war. I think this is very dangerous now. On the other hand, he mentioned the Istanbul peace talks. And I think the Istanbul peace talks could be a chance to stop the war.
Putin said on Tuesday that peace talks with Ukraine had hit a dead end. You're suggesting that when you spoke to him, that you still see an opportunity in those talks.
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, I give you now my impression I had because he mentioned the Istanbul peace talks. And I informed President Zelensky about that. And before I went to Putin, I discussed with President Zelensky if it is useful to do this trip. He said, please, if you go there, tell him that it's now needed to have safe corridors, humanitarian corridors for the people in Mariupol. They don't have water, no electricity. We have to think about the wounded there. So these were also the messages I confronted President Putin.
Some Europeans and some Ukrainians criticized you for going to Moscow at this point. What's your response?
I think it's useful to go there, to look in his eyes and to say the war has to end. Because, you know, I think it's also useful that other prime ministers of the European Union talk to him by phone calls. But I think it's much more stronger, first to visit Kiev, to visit Ukraine, to see what is going on there, and with these pictures in the mind, going to Moscow and confront Putin with these pictures, with what you saw there. You know, the war crimes have to be investigated by the international justice. And I think it's much more stronger to look someone in his eyes.
Did you accuse him of war crimes?
Well, I confronted him with that, and I told him that it's necessary to have the international justice, the United Nations there. And, you know, for him, it's not easy to talk about that, but we have to do that.
Did he accept that there are war crimes being committed?
Well, you know, it's President Putin. In this position, he was not clear.
Is it your sense that Putin is getting a full reporting of this war from his generals, from his military assets on the ground?
You know, it's a really good question. I don't know it, but what I know is to confront him with that is useful. I think to do something is better than to do nothing. And, well, I think other European leaders should do the same. But the most important thing is to visit first Ukraine, to see what is going on there, what happens there, to see the suffer of Ukrainian people, and to confront Putin with that.
You spoke to President Zelensky. He is absolutely adamant that sanctions should be ramped up on Russia, including sanctions across the board on energy. The European Commission has said nothing is off the table. Are you adamant that Austria will not agree to oil and gas sanctions under any circumstances?
Well, first of all, Austria is not alone with this argument against the gas embargo, and also the German Federation, Hungary, and other member states of the European Union. And on the other side, Austria stands strong with the other EU member states with the sanctions against the Russian Federation. But sanctions must hurt Russia more than the European Union.
Do you worry that the issue of a gas embargo could fracture what is otherwise, at present, a united Europe?
No, I don't think so, because, you know, we are 27 member states, and we decided together about the sanctions against the Russian Federation, and the sanctions already decided are really tough and strong. And we will decide about more sanctions against Russia because, we want to show that there is unity in the European Union, that this war has to end.
But there isn't unity, is there, on the issue of gas, for example? And that's really important because President Zelensky implores Europe to do more on energy. And at this point, despite multiple sanctions, rafts of sanctions, to date, they haven't stopped Vladimir Putin. So if not energy, what else is left in the toolbox?
Well, a lot of possible sanctions. Now we decided new one, for example, for small electronic parts produced in the Western world. And these small electronic parts are used in Russian weapons. So an embargo is very useful to stop a tank, for example, or to stop a drone. I think we should think about sanctions now in a more intelligent way, how we can hurt the Russian Federation, but not be hurt us. I think this is the main important thing. There is a decision in the European Union that we try everything to become independent from Russian gas. And it's also the willing of Austria, for sure. But it's not possible now. It will take time. And in this time, we had to decide about other sanctions, as I said, who hurt Russia more than the European Union.
Do you genuinely believe that, what is this, multiple rafts of sanctions to date on Vladimir Putin are working?
It's a good question. I think it will change. Our sanctions, we decided, will change the Russian situation for decades. I think Putin knows that. What we see now is that there is a war inside Ukraine. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think he needs also a kind of
Hello everyone, I'm Zain Asher in New York and welcome to One World. New satellite images support what military experts have been predicting for weeks. Russia is gearing up for a major offensive in eastern Ukraine. It's a crucial battle that could set the stage for the next phase of this brutal war. France warns it could happen within days. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Mariupol is at the heart of the conflict. Russian troops are closing in on the besieged city, and the Kremlin claims more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines have surrendered. And after a failed push to take Kyiv, Moscow is stepping up its attacks on Ukraine's second largest city. This video, what you're seeing here, appears to show cluster bombs exploding in a residential area of Kharkiv. For the first time, US President Joe Biden is calling the atrocities in Ukraine a genocide. It's something Ukraine's leader has said repeatedly and something he reiterated once again today. I want you to listen to this.
The residential compounds were decimated by all sorts of rockets and bombs and artillery, in particular the phosphorus bombs, and some others bound by international law. This is obvious terror against the civilian population. This is a try to break the spirit of the nation, to conquer the Ukrainians, or simply annihilate them.
In northeastern Ukraine, local officials say that a growing number of bodies have been discovered since Russia's retreat, many of them showing signs of torture. CNN's Fred Pleitgen joins us live now from the capital, Kyiv. So at the moment, let's talk about the Mariupol situation, because Russia's saying that about 1,000 soldiers there have surrendered. What are the Ukrainians saying about that, Fred? What more do we know?
Well, the Ukrainians aren't denying that, saying, but at the same time, the Ukrainians are saying that the defenders of Mariupol, obviously from their military and also from the Azov Brigade, that they are actually still holding out there in Mariupol, at least in a small part of that city. It does appear as though Russia has taken most parts of Mariupol. There is some video out there seeming to show Russian military vehicles patrolling the streets in parts of Mariupol. In fact, you see one right here on your screen with a Z on the side, of course, the sign of Russia's invading force in that part of Ukraine. We always have to point out, we're not obviously on the ground in Mariupol. It's impossible for us to get there, so can't really independently verify some of those videos. However, what the Ukrainians are saying is that the force that they still have on the ground, some Marines and the Azov Brigade, that they've managed to join forces. The Russians had separated those two forces by driving a wedge between them, but they've now managed to link up and then pool, essentially, their defensive power that they still have left. Obviously, it's power that is waning because they are cut off, they are encircled, but the Marines there had been saying that they are going to hold on, as they put it, fight to the last bullet. Zain?
And there's obviously a lot of talk right now about Russia committing war crimes in Ukraine. I understand that you've been spending time with Ukrainian prosecutors who are documenting, investigating, and gathering evidence for the many deaths outside Kyiv. Talk us through what you're learning, Fred.
Yeah, you know, one of the interesting things that President Biden said yesterday, when he for the first time said he believed that what is happening in Ukraine right now is genocide, he also said that we would have to wait and see what international courts of law have to say about this. Well, that's exactly what the Ukrainians are working on right now. They are collecting evidence in thousands of cases of what they believe to be or could be war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. And I was able to speak yesterday to the prosecutor general of this country, who's really taken the lead in all of this. And she says it's going to be a long way, but they certainly are going to keep doing their work in an objective way, despite the fact that obviously many of them are moved by some of the things that have happened here. We do have to warn our viewers that what you're about to see is graphic and very disturbing, but I do think it's important to see. Here's what we witnessed.
Even as Russian troops mass in eastern Ukraine for what the U.S. believes will be a huge offensive, authorities in Kyiv continue digging up bodies. Painstaking work that goes hand in hand with investigating Russia's attack on Kyiv and possible crimes committed by Vladimir Putin's invading troops. Prosecutor General Irina Venediktova is leading the charge. She spoke to me at the edge of a mass grave in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha.
For us, the best motivation is justice. And of course, we understand that all Ukrainians want fast justice, true and fast justice. That's why we do everything to document all evidence, all facts of war crimes that we have here in Ukraine.
French forensic investigators are now also on the scene, not because Ukraine lacks expertise, but because Kyiv wants to be as transparent as possible in the face of Russian disinformation efforts.
We want to do our job absolutely open with standards of international humanitarian law. It's very high standards. That's why when here we have our international colleagues, we understand that they can see everything. They can see a real situation here, real graves, real dead bodies.
After Ukrainian forces managed to expel Russian troops from around Kyiv and some other areas they'd occupied in Ukraine, authorities have discovered scores of dead bodies. Today, another 6 found in just one basement outside Kyiv. The prosecutor tells me they are collecting evidence in thousands of cases.
Now we started more than 6,000 cases. It's crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression crimes. And we started on the first days of war, we started the case about genocide.
All this as Russia still claims its forces that invaded Ukraine have not harmed any civilians. On a visit to a spaceport with Belarusian strongman Alexander Lukashenko, Russian President Vladimir Putin again claimed his forces are fighting against would-be Ukrainian Nazis in what he calls a, quote, special operation. The goals are absolutely clear and they are noble, he said. I said it from the beginning and want to draw your attention to that.
There are some in the U.S. at the top level who have spoken about a possible war crimes trial against Vladimir Putin. Is that something you think could ever be possible, and it's something that you're working towards to provide evidence for?
Of course, I think that everyone understands who is responsible for this war. That's why we do everything to to document evidences. But we are here in Ukraine and actually understand who is responsible for all of this.
The investigators' work is complicated by the fact that the war is still going on, and they can't reach many devastated areas like the encircled city of Mariupol, where Ukraine's president says tens of thousands have been killed. But Irina Benediktova says no matter how long it takes, she will press on.
It's actually extremely important because if we will be successful as the prosecutors, I am sure that we can stop such aggressions in the future.
All right, that was Fred Fleiken reporting there. Finland says it will make a decision on whether to apply for NATO membership within weeks, not months. The Finnish Prime Minister said there is no timetable on the decision, but that Russia's invasion of Ukraine had changed everything. She was speaking alongside her Swedish counterpart, who said Sweden would also decide on potential NATO membership after serious analysis of the situation. CNN's Nick Robertson joins us live now from Brussels with more. So here's the thing, Nick. Finland and Russia, of course, share a border. How does this change the dynamic between the two countries in terms of tensions?
This is certainly going to make Russia upset. It's not what President Putin wanted. He wanted it. He went to war in Ukraine essentially to push NATO further away. That was his demand going back to last December. If Finland joins, that will double the length of physical border that NATO has with Russia. Again, that's not something President Putin is going to want to see. Everyone here in Brussels is expecting both Sweden and Finland first, probably to request NATO membership. I don't think we can underestimate the significance of today in terms of geopolitical change. There's been a lot of talk about how President Putin was sort of wanting to change the security architecture of Europe. But today, these announcements that were made together in Sweden by these two prime ministers standing side by side, speaking English, talking about how they cooperate with each other and already cooperate with NATO, was a very, very strong message that President Putin has so driven concern in these nations that they think that the only way that they can get security in the future is to be within NATO itself. This is how they framed it.
The European security architecture have changed fundamentally after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The change in the security landscape makes it necessary to analyze how we best secure peace for Finland and in our region in the future.
There is a before and after 24th of February. The security landscape has completely changed, both with the demands from Russia in December and then the invasion of Ukraine. And given that situation, we have to really think through what is best for Sweden and our security and our peace in this new situation.
What they realized was very simple. They looked at what happened to Ukraine and before the war and the threats from Russia, and NATO saying to Ukraine, we know you want to be a member, we can support you with weapons, but we can't give you troops to support you. These Nordic nations looked at that and said, well, that could be us. That could be Putin trying to take territory from us. We'd be in the same situation unless we join NATO. NATO made that very clear to Ukraine, and the message was read loud and clear by both Sweden and Finland.
And Nick, from Russia's perspective, does the threat of an expanding NATO make Russia less likely to negotiate? Does it push both countries further away from peace? Because that is, of course, Vladimir Putin's perspective.
It is, and Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has said, don't think that a bigger NATO is going to make Europe any more stable. It's not clear where Putin's going to finally draw the line. Will he be limited militarily by what he can gain in Ukraine and therefore settle for something less than being able to push NATO back? Or will he finally, over a period of time, maybe years, get a military victory in Ukraine, dominate that country, and then want to impose his military will on other nations deeper into Europe? It's just not clear how far Putin can go. The assessment, of course, that the United States, that NATO, that Ukraine, that the European Union are all making is, you have to stop Putin now in Ukraine. You have to support the Ukrainians militarily, which is what they're doing. But the consensus is dealing with Putin at the moment. You cannot know what he's thinking. You cannot know what his next moves are going to be, and therefore all bets are off the table. Therefore, you have to double down on your own security, and that is what's happening here. That's the impact. Does it make the world safer? Probably not, but it's a reaction to the ground realities that were ground realities since World War II that President Putin has shaken. Again, we cannot understate how big the changes are that are happening. We talk about the war in Ukraine, but big, significant geopolitical changes are happening because of it, and today's witnessed some of that.
Right, Nick Robertson, live for us there. Thank you so much. All right, days after becoming the first Western leader to meet with Vladimir Putin since Russia invaded Ukraine, Austria's chancellor is speaking to CNN about that meeting. Karl Nehammer says he decided to visit Moscow to confront the Russian president about the atrocities he witnessed in Ukraine. I want you to listen to what he had to say.
First of all, my first trip was to Ukraine to meet President Zelensky and Prime Minister there, to visit Bucha. This is the village where we could see a mass grave. We talked there to the priest, and he informed us that the people in this mass grave were murdered by Russian soldiers. And afterwards, I did a decision to go to Moscow to look in President Putin's eyes and confront him with that what I saw, the war crimes, the loss of Russian soldiers and Russian army, the need to stop the war, and the clear message that the war has to end.
The Austrian leader also said he discussed the Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in Istanbul and said he still sees them as an opportunity to end the conflict. Right, still to come here on One World, we'll speak to a Ukrainian lawmaker about the situation on the ground in Kyiv, also find out what she thinks about the US president's use of the term genocide. Plus, CNN visits a small farming town in southern Ukraine, bruised and battered by Russian shelling. But now it's serving as a refuge for those hoping to flee this brutal war. That's coming up. Russia is redeploying forces and ramping up attacks in eastern Ukraine. At least 7 people were wounded when a missile strike damaged an apartment block in the Donetsk region. The military governor says that Russia's main tactic now is to kill and terrorize civilians. This is new video shows what appeared to be cluster munitions exploding in a civilian area of Kharkiv. You can actually see at least 4 explosions if you count them. They're just seconds apart, spanning about 90 meters or so. The UN has said that such attacks in populated areas may amount to war crimes. Now let's bring in Ukrainian parliament member Alyona Shkrum. She witnessed the atrocities by Russian forces firsthand. She and other MPs went to Bucha last week to visit, as did, of course, President Zelensky. Images of dead civilians and mass graves from that devastated city have drawn international outrage. Alyona Shkrum joins us live now from Kyiv. So let's just start with what you saw and what you witnessed, the devastation and the horrors in Bucha. Walk us through that.
Yeah, well, hello. Obviously, we've all seen a lot of pictures, a lot of videos, a lot of footage from Bucha and another small town near Bucha, which is Irpin, and a small village which is called Borodyanka, all liberated in the north of Kiev. But believe me, to see it in person and to actually talk to the people who survived the occupation, it's completely, you know, another level of terrifying. I think we are almost going numb, not to let us feel the pain from seeing it. So we've been to obviously the destroyed bridge from Irpin, where we've seen thousands of people being evacuated through. And we've seen also the common grave in Bucha, which is right now being exhumated by the prosecutor general. And we are looking into finding 260 dead bodies, all civilians, a lot of women and men tortured before killed in the common grave, in a one basically big, you know, grave done by the Russians in Bucha. That is probably one of the most horrifying things I've seen. And the stories that people tell us, those who survived, are, you know, also very terrifying in their honesty. So I have to tell you that Bucha was, you know, a big city. About 95% of people were evacuated. We managed to do it, even though it was under the shellings. And about 5,000 date. Out of this 5,000, 10% are dead right now and were killed. So each 10th, you know, person in every family, in every apartment building was killed.
You describe it as one of the most horrifying things that you've ever seen. I mean, it's traumatic just to even listen to, let alone actually have to experience and witness yourself. As you know, the US president has described what's happening on the ground there in Ukraine as genocide. Given those comments by the US president, what more should America be doing, do you think?
I think that President Biden is absolutely correct. We are actually asking other parliaments in the world, and we will do a formal, you know, demand from our parliament to recognize those events as genocide by Russians of Ukrainian citizens. Obviously, it comes to the level of genocide because it is killing civilians, women, children, men, everybody just because they are Ukrainian. So those people had no military background, had no risk, had no weapons, had no ammunition, nothing. They were just being killed because they went out to the streets to get food, or they needed to go out in the yard with a dog, or, you know, they were just living there, and they were killed just because purely they are Ukrainians, who Putin described as the Russians who actually like the West and need to be corrected in a way, right? So he's trying to correct us by this military thing, obviously by killing us. So the Convention on Genocide states clearly that after recognition of genocide, or after the evidence that it could be a genocide, we need an international tribunal to be there, as it was for Rwanda. We need to gather evidence from all kind of international experts. So it's not just our prosecutor general who is gathering evidence. We also ask, you know, people from the forces from the US, from Europe, from France, units who could come here and gather evidence of war crimes and genocide for us, so that it could be very clear and very specific. And then we go, as to the convention says, it is the highest crime in the world, and Putin and his soldiers should be held responsible for that in the international tribunal.
Right, so you talk about international tribunals, you talk about the fact that the international community should come together and really investigate what's happening in Ukraine, but that all takes time. That's all well and good in the long term. But in the short term, what more should America be doing, especially given that President Biden has acknowledged that he believes that what's happening on the ground in Ukraine is a genocide? What more should America be doing to prevent further deaths and further bloodshed?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking this question. It's very straightforward. We need more weapons. We need to defend ourselves. And for me, as a Ukrainian, there is no more distinction between defensive weapons or offensive weapons. Everything for us is defensive. It's on our territory. We are defending our women, our children, and our cities. So we do need more weapons. I know President Biden has done a lot. We need more because the war is still going, and Putin is deploying all he can right now to the east, to Kharkiv, Izium, Mariupol. Mariupol, obviously a disaster in terms of the city, and you've seen the pictures. So more weapons, more actually sanctions in a way that Russia cannot find a way across those sanctions. So we know that other banks who are not being turned off from SWIFT are being used for the Russian oligarchs and Russia to actually take away from the sanctions. And also the cryptocurrency has been used for that. So we are working together with the US, and we would ask US to do more in terms of sanctioning Russian banks and turning them off from SWIFT and making sure that there are no loopholes in the sanctions. We will need, again, more push on the European leaders for the total embargo of all of the energy, gas and oil resources from Russia. Europe has to stand up in this way. We are working with them. We will ask President Biden, to give them a push, especially, I just came back from France, from seeing President Macron personally. Macron today said he does not think that it was a genocide. It is quite shocking for me and unexpected. He's in part of the campaign. Obviously, the campaign is hard for him, but he has to acknowledge, white when he sees white and black when he sees black. We would need to help France and Germany to be, to understand this war is not about Ukraine. It's about the whole Europe for sure.
All right. Thank you so much, Aliona, for being with us. Thank you so much for speaking up about this. We appreciate it. All right, still to come here on One World. Missing out on an education, how Russia's war is disrupting the lives of young people and what some aid agencies are doing to help. And the man police were calling a person of interest is now identified as a suspect in the Brooklyn subway attack. The latest on the manhunt coming up. Hello and welcome back to One World. In just a moment, I'll be speaking with Yasmin Sharif from Education Cannot Wait about supporting the educational needs of Ukrainian child refugees in Moldova. But first, let's catch up on the news for you. Poland and the Baltic states are sending a strong message of support to Ukraine. Their leaders met with President Volodymyr Zelensky after traveling to Kyiv by train. The visit is focused on the investigation of war crimes and providing aid to Ukrainian citizens. Ukraine says that after a risky maneuver, the last remaining defenders in war-ravaged Mariupol have managed to break through Russian lines and join forces. Moscow, meantime, claims that more than 1,000 Ukrainian Marines in the besieged southern port city have surrendered. CNN is not in Mariupol and therefore unable to verify these details. A new video posted to social media appears to show a cluster bomb exploding in a civilian part of Ukraine's Kharkiv region. You can actually see the blast on your screen on this video here just seconds apart. The UN says that the use of cluster munitions in populated areas may actually amount to war crimes. And the United Nations warns the world's most vulnerable people will be facing further food insecurity because of the war in Ukraine. Secretary General Antonio Guterres made an urgent plea just moments ago to ease the burden of rising food and energy prices.
First, the impact of the war is global and systemic. As many as 1.7 billion people, one-third of whom are already living in poverty, are now highly exposed to disruptions in food, energy and finance systems that are triggering increases in poverty and hunger. 36 countries count on Russia and Ukraine for more than half of their wheat imports, including some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries of the world. And prices were already on the rise, but the war has made a bad situation far worse.
A senior U.S. defense official estimates that Russia has just above 80% of the combat power it amassed before the invasion began. I want to bring in Ed Lavandera, who's joining us live now from Odessa. But here's the thing, despite all of that, though, Ed, the Ukrainians have basically defied all odds, defied all expectations, and really used every ounce of determination to protect their homeland.
Hello, Zane. Well, we've seen an incredible amount of creativity and ingenuity in many small villages in Ukraine to fight back Russian forces. But what we're also finding is that just because a village celebrates a victory, the war isn't over. One look at these massive craters in the small Ukrainian town of Bashtanka near Mykolaiv, and it's not hard to imagine the horror inflicted by Russian forces bombing this neighborhood. Bashtanka Mayor Alexander Bergovy brought us here. He says the Russian plane that dropped the bomb circled over these homes several times before unleashing the explosive attack. This is a simple, peaceful town, he says, with just ordinary people, no military. Farming is what we do here, to feed the country and the world. There was a 70-year-old man in this house peeling potatoes when this bomb struck. What happened to him? God decided not to take him away. He tells me the man survived. Yes, for more than a week in March, this little town of 12,000 people fought off the Russians any way it could. Town council member Vitaly Homersky put out a Facebook plea that if anyone knew how to fire a cannon, they should race out to help. A humble force of about 100 people pushed the Russians out. More than 170 buildings were damaged. The charred wreckage was left all over town. But the mayor tells the story of one fighter who became an instant legend, a 78-year-old man who was told he was too old to fight. Instead, he made a Molotov cocktail and threw it at a Russian artillery system, blowing it up. We've asked to speak with the man, but we're told by city officials that they're protecting his identity to keep him safe. The town might have won the battle, but this war never ends. Bashtanka is now a frontline refuge for thousands of Ukrainians hoping to escape. Every day at this church, buses drop off refugees fleeing Russian-occupied areas just a few miles away. Zakruzetska Ruslana says she left the city of Kherson after enduring weeks of bombardment with her 2 children and nieces.
They break into people's homes every night, drag people out, beat them up. My neighbors were beaten up. Thank God they're still alive. They're probably doing that to scare people, so they're always in fear. It was horrible there. Every day people are going crazy, to be honest. It's intolerable. The children, the tension is terrible. You don't know if you'll wake up alive.
Escaping alive is a dream, as we found closer to the front lines. The nearby village of Yevkino has endured weeks of shelling. You can see the munition and the shrapnel. You can see this building over here peppered with holes. As we meet with the village headman, it's clear the fighting isn't over. What is that noise? Yes, they are firing, he says. Alexander Kovriga tells us Russians fired cluster artillery at a group of young people charging their phones in this spot. They do it on purpose so people will panic, he tells me. We understand that there was a refugee, 17 years old, who came here trying to escape, and she was killed? Lydia Dominica couldn't escape the Russian strikes, a young woman trying to reach Bashtanka. Her mother says she was studying food production and shared these photos so her daughter cannot be forgotten. Inside Bashtanka's war room, council member Vitaly Homersky shows us the calendar where they mark the days of war. When the war started, our life was divided, he tells me. There's before and after. We mark every day we survived this battle. Right now, the Russian army is regrouping and is expected to attack again from the east. We are 25 miles away from the front line. How concerned are you that the Russians are going to be able to get back here?
Ми не переживаємо. Наша країна вміє 2 речі.
The mayor says, we are not concerned. Our country is good at 2 things, making bread and fighting. If we need to fight, we all rise up and fight. If we don't need to fight, we grow bread. But right now, the town of Bashtanka remains on the front lines, giving families like Zakruzetska Ruslana and her daughters a way to catch a bus and leave the war behind. And Zain, I want to point out that we heard as we were reporting this story that there was this 17-year-old who had been killed, but nobody knew her name, nobody knew where she was from. And I want to thank our fixer and translator, Costa, who worked the phones relentlessly, and we were able to track down the young woman's mother, and that's how we were able to bring you her name and her picture so that the world cannot forget. Zain?
Absolutely brilliant. All right, Ed Lavandera live for us there. Thank you so much, and thanks to your fixer as well for that. All right, Moldova is hosting roughly 100,000 Ukrainians who fled the war. Among them, 50,000 children, many of whom are no longer enrolled in school and are missing out, of course, on their education. To address this, representatives from Education Cannot Wait, the UN's Global Education Fund, are visiting Moldova to scale up support for refugee children. Let's discuss all of this with the director of Education Cannot Wait, Yasmin Sharif. She joins us live now from Moldova. Yasmin, good to see you. Thank you so much for being with us. We know that half of Ukraine's children have had to flee the country. Given that kind of disruption in terms of schooling, in terms of education, what does that do to this generation's hopes and dreams?
Thank you very much, Zain, for having me on board in today's broadcasting. Thanks a lot. Well, it does a lot, and here we are speaking about also in Ukraine 900 schools that have been destroyed, bombed, targeted, and destructed. So the education is now disrupted for 3.3 million children and youth inside Ukraine. And what it does is that their future hopes and all that comes with the education, psychosocial services, academic training, social and emotional learning skills, all of that is replaced by a massive traumatizing war. And we are meeting these refugees in Moldova. Right now, Moldova, which is the poorest country in Europe, are hosting 50,000 refugee children and youth So they are among those 5 million refugees who have fled the country. And they are hosted. UN agencies like UNHCR and UNICEF have set up transit centers. The government of Moldova has shown enormous generosity in allowing them to cross the border. But out of the 50,000, only 1,800 children and youth are actually registered and have joined the public schools in Moldova, because Moldova wasn't ready for this. They have to start operating in humanitarian mode now.
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. You know, the country wasn't ready, as you point out. Moldova is one of the poorest countries in Europe. And also, they're now dealing with an extra 400,000 Ukrainian children. I mean, you know, just walk us through what that does to the education system and the infrastructure in Moldova. Do they have the ability to really absorb 500,000 new children?
Well, today it's 50,000. But if there's going to be a second wave, depending on where the war in Ukraine is going, and there are fears that if it moves on to Odessa and the eastern part, there's going to be a second influx. Moldova is not ready for this. The absorption capacity wasn't there before, and now it is being stretched to its limits. The teachers there are not enough teachers. There are different languages also. They speak Romania in Moldova. So you have to train the teachers or find teachers who can also speak and communicate with Ukrainian refugee children. Also, and I met yesterday a mother and her 2 daughters. She had fled from Odessa, taken the only family car, leaving her husband behind and her mother. She was absolutely traumatized, the mother, not to talk about the children. The enormous need for psychosocial support. Both daughters were traumatized and are today attending the school in Moldova that lacks the resources, sanitation, teacher, language, and psychosocial services and protection.
Yeah, and as you point out, I mean, this is really difficult for the country. So 400,000 people total, but as you point out, 50,000 children. Now, are most of these children, because you point out about the language barriers, which is a key thing to remember, how important is online learning here? Because of the pandemic, for at least 1 to 2 years, the world has gotten used to online learning. Has that strangely helped in this situation?
Well, you know, the schooling in Ukraine was good. And many teachers are trying, and the Ministry of Education in Ukraine is trying to work regionally so that their students of Ukraine can continue online learning in refuge. However, the way the infrastructure is being destroyed in Ukraine today, the capacity to actually use remote online learning from neighboring countries is being impacted. Remember that the teachers in Ukraine are seeking shelter right now. Their electricity connections are being cut. So to operate as a teacher from a country in a brutal conflict is also very difficult. So what neighboring countries like Moldova are doing, they are trying to help as much as they can by integrating them in their existing schools that exist in Moldova. But again, as I said, the capacity is absolutely overstretched.
Yeah, we've been focusing a lot on the children, and that is, of course, important. But you point out that, you know, there are teachers involved in this as well. Yasmin Sharif, live for us there. Thank you so much for joining us on this important story.
Thank you very much.
All right, still to come here on One World. Police have identified a suspect in that terrifying shooting on a New York subway. The clues that led them to him when we come back. Police now say they have a suspect in that mass shooting on a New York subway Tuesday morning. Authorities are looking for 62-year-old Frank James. Police say that a van rented to James was found nearby, and law enforcement officials say a gun recovered from the scene was purchased by James. Police believe that James set off smoke grenades inside the subway car and then began firing a handgun at other passengers. You can actually see the chaos. This frightening video as passengers try to escape from the subway train. 10 people were shot in the attacks, and police say the shooter fired his weapon 33 times. Let's get more now on what police know about the person they're looking for. Joining us live now is CNN's Jason Carroll. So, Jason, just walk us through this manhunt that's underway and what more we know about 62-year-old Frank James.
Well, Zane, you hit on one of the latest developments, and that is that investigators have officially announced that they have linked that 9mm Glock handgun that they found here at the scene to the suspect, Frank James. You remember it was just a few hours ago that Frank James was being referred to as a person of interest. Well, police say that they were able to change that category from person of interest to suspect once they were able to officially release that they officially connected him to the purchase of that weapon. In addition, investigators are looking at some of his other purchases, including a gas mask that he apparently bought on eBay. You remember that some of the eyewitnesses who were out here yesterday during that morning rush hour shooting said that the suspect was wearing some sort of a gas mask. Well, now police are telling us, saying that the suspect in this particular case, Frank James, purchased some sort of a gas mask on eBay. This as the NYPD continues to conduct witnesses, continues to look for and interview, if they can, any of James' known relatives, anything that they can do to try to find and track down his whereabouts. Now, in addition to that, they're also going to be taking a very close look at James's social media. That's an important part of this investigation as well, because as you know, his social media showed him posting a number of very disturbing and sometimes violent posts. And in fact, just on Monday, James posted on YouTube, again, this is Monday, just a day before the shooting, posted a video on YouTube about killing people. In addition to that, some of his other social media posts talk about things like the mayor of New York City, homelessness in New York City, the subway system. In addition to that, violence as well. So perhaps once they get a more of a clear picture of that, that may end up leading them to a motive for the shooting. But once again, right now the focus is on finding Frank James, and what has been happening is we now know that a number of people, including the U.S. Marshals, has joined the search. That's along with the NYPD, the FBI, and the ATF as well. Zane?
Jason, so how safe do New Yorkers feel in the subway today?
That is a good question, and I have to tell you, even before this, Zane, there was a lot of unease among New Yorkers in terms of riding the subways, whether it be early or late at night, simply because the city has seen an uptick in violence throughout the transit system and throughout the city. And in fact, New York City's new mayor, Eric Adams, just in January, had told the NYPD, you know, we're going to beef up patrol on the subways to make people feel more comfortable about riding on the subways, and then all of a sudden yesterday you have this mass shooting. So the unease that was already here in the city for riding in the subways, much, much deeper now.
Of course, right. Jason Carroll live for us there. Thank you so much. And there is a desperate search going on right now for survivors of a deadly flooding in South Africa. Officials in KwaZulu-Natal are calling it one of the worst storms in the history of the country. We know that at least 250 people are dead, and mudslides have trapped many others inside buildings. There has been terrible damage to the local infrastructure, with cell phone towers downed and electrical plants flooded as well. CNN meteorologist Chad Myers is tracking the storm. Some of this video that we're seeing here, Chad, is really frightening. Just walk us through what more we know right now.
It really is frightening. Some places 300 millimeters of rain in 24 hours. That's 3 times as much rain as Durban should get for the entire month of April. all because of a storm that just sat right close to shore, spinning, in my opinion, because I'm from the Northern Hemisphere, the wrong direction, but that is actually the correct direction in the Southern Hemisphere. It always throws me off when I see these storms going clockwise. But there it was onshore for a very long time, kind of a subtropical storm. It had some cold characteristics. It wasn't a tropical cyclone yet, but you can begin to see along the coast how much rainfall fell. 300 millimeters in spots. And as you work your way up into South Africa, the elevation gets higher here. So all of the rain that was just to the west of Durban, that all ran down the hills and washed away tunnels and washed away bridges and culverts. And obviously even those shipping containers that were in the port harbor below just washed away in the water. Look at Margate at 454 millimeters of rain in just 24 hours. So what happens now? Well, the rain is gone. That low pressure is gone, but there still could be about 20 or so millimeters over the next 5 days. That shouldn't cause any flooding in a normal time, but when all your ground is already completely saturated, anything could certainly run off, Zane.
All right, Chad Myers live for us there. Thank you so much. Right, still to come here, a look at 3 Americans being held in Russia and what their chances are of coming home. The U.S. State Department is calling on Moscow not to treat Americans detained in Russia any differently because of the horrific events in Ukraine. 3 Americans are being held in Russian detention, and their families are worried they may become pawns used by Vladimir Putin. CNN's Brian Todd has more.
After spending nearly 2 months in a Russian jail, serious concerns about the condition of star American basketball player Brittany Griner, concerns voiced by the head of the WNBA Players Union on ABC.
We're really most concerned about her health and safety, especially her mental health. We're hearing that in that respect, she's okay.
The WNBA commissioner says Griner, jailed on allegations she was carrying cannabis oil at the Moscow airport, is safe and is getting access to her legal team in Russia.
We're trying everything we can, every angle, working through with her
legal representation, her agent, elected leaders, the administration.
Greiner has been able to see her representative in Russia twice a week and is able to receive letters and correspondence, sources tell ESPN. But Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine could dash any hopes for a speedy release.
He's not going to release anyone that he has in custody. He's going to try to use it, as he has been probably behind the scenes all along, as a bargaining chip to get something from us.
There's very little the U.S. government can do right now. We have very limited leverage over Russia for very obvious reasons right now, given the political situation.
One former U.S. official believes Putin has strong motivation to keep holding Greiner, the fact that she's a U.S. Olympic gold medalist.
Remember, she was seized in February, right after the Olympics, when Russia was roundly embarrassed yet again for doping of its Olympic athletes. And so this might be also a way of getting revenge at the U.S. Olympic Committee.
Another American held in Russia, Trevor Reed, on Tuesday had a court appearance by video, where his appeal was kicked back to a lower court. His parents are worried he may have tuberculosis.
He looks terrible in that shot that they had on the tweet, and we're really concerned because he really looks thin.
U.S. officials openly concerned about Reed's health.
We do believe that he needs urgent treatment to prevent any further deterioration in his medical condition.
Reed was sentenced to 9 years for allegedly endangering the lives of Russian police officers while drunk, which his family and U.S. officials deny. On Tuesday, Reed's father made a bold statement about his son's situation.
They've taken him for trade, and that's what they want, and he's not coming home unless they get that.
Could Brittany Griner, Trevor Reed, or the other American detained in Russia, Paul Whelan, be traded?
They're extremely rare, and in the current political situation, it will be especially difficult to arrange something like that. Not impossible, but extremely difficult in the current conditions.
The analysts we spoke to say it's a risky strategy for family members and others to speak out so often on behalf of these detainees in Russia, especially now, given that it might irritate Vladimir Putin even more. And recently, WNBA superstar Lisa Leslie said that people in the women's basketball world were told not to make a big fuss out of Brittany Griner's case, out of concern that she might be used as a pawn while the Ukraine war is still going on. Brian Todd, CNN, Washington.
Thank you so much for watching One World. I'm Zain Asher. Amanpour is up next. You're watching CNN.
I'm Jim Bitterman in Paris, and this is CNN.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Amanpour. Here's what's coming up.
Your family budget, your ability to fill up your tank, none of it should hinge on whether a dictator declares war and commits genocide half a world away.
Inflation bites American families, and President Biden blames a genocidal Vladimir Putin. We unpack the state of a wartime economy with Jared Bernstein from the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Plus, investigating the barbarity that shocked the world. Correspondent Dan Rivers goes back to Bucha, what it says about Putin's war. Then, White Lies, the extraordinary and untold story of civil rights activist Walter White, journalist and author A.J. Baim on White's double life and how he changed America. And what the war in Ukraine means for the whole world with Zanny Minton Beddoes, editor-in-chief of The Economist. Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiane Amanpour in London. President Biden is up against it, trying to make his economic case to a nation reeling from inflation, exacerbated by rising energy prices because of the war in Ukraine. Indeed, he's tying his economic pain directly to the war, labeling it the Putin price hike. He's also now calling the mounting catalogue of Russian horrors around Ukraine genocide. Sanctions leveled by the West are fueling inflation in all their countries. In the United States, it is at its highest level since 1981. And no doubt ordinary Americans are starting to feel it. Putin has always banked on causing more hardship than feeling it himself. So, will the West keep up its tough stance? Is the political will there? Jared Bernstein is a member of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Biden, and he's joining me now from the White House. So welcome to the program, Mr. Bernstein. And let's just take what the president said himself. We've laid out the figures and the facts. How much of it do you agree is the Putin price hike, as he says?
We can actually put a number on that. If we look at yesterday's inflation report, inflation rose 1.2% in the month of March. 70% of that was attributable to energy and almost 2/3 to gasoline alone. If you look at the pattern at which energy prices have gone up, they very clearly relate to both the run-up to the invasion and the invasion itself. So the president is spot on when he's making those points.
So let's talk about what you sometimes label headwinds, because inflation actually existed before the war. And right now, as we said, it's the highest in 40 years or so, or at least since 1981, and I guess that's 40 years. It's about 8.5% right now. Yeah, it's not my strong suit. But how is it hurting Americans, and how can you staunch that pain?
It is a real challenge for Americans just across the board. I mean, any of us who've been shopping. I mean, last weekend I went to visit my daughter in college. We stayed at the same hotel we'd stayed in the last time we visited her, and it was a very different price tag. So this is something that, as the president said, is a clear challenge to family budgets. But I think amidst these headwinds, what sometimes gets lost is the impact of both some existing tailwinds in the economy, some things that are helping to lift growth and provide opportunities and incomes to Americans, along with, perhaps more germane to this part of our conversation, the president's actions to lower some of the cost pressures facing consumers, whether it's gas prices at the pump, whether it's our actions at the ports to help get goods from ship to shelf more quickly, whether it's our trucking initiatives to help improve transportation. There's a full broad set of actions we're taking to help, and they are helping in ways that I can tick off to you, but I think it's important to recognize both sides of that equation.
So tick them off, because obviously, Jared Bernstein, that story is not getting around. I mean, I could read you the lamentable poll numbers, which are just, you know, pretty awful, and you don't need my bad math to be able to figure that out. The most recent CNN poll says the president's job approval is at 41%, approval for handling the economy is at 37%. So if you have these things that you say are already bearing fruit for the consumer, Why is it not showing up in their opinions?
Great question. So these things can both be true, and in fact, they both are true. There are many important advantages in our economy, particularly compared to other advanced economies like many in Europe. So for example, GDP growth was about 5.5% last year. In Germany, it was about 2%. Now, you don't need GDP growth. What does that mean for real people? It means jobs. 7.9 million jobs since this president got here. An unemployment rate at 3.6%. That is a tick above where it was pre-pandemic. Again, what do all these statistics mean for people? It means that they can go into the job market and get the jobs, the hours, the pay that they need in order to help make ends meet. And in fact, if you look at total compensation, it is up 10% faster than inflation over the past year. That's both the contribution from more jobs, more hours, and more wages. But that's the one side of the equation. I said two things are true. At the same time, families are facing elevated prices. You heard the president say it today, whether it's the pump, whether it's the supermarket, whether it's housing, that inflation is still elevated. Now, gas prices are actually down 25 cents a gallon since that last CPI report. So we didn't see that in yesterday's report. And that definitely is partly attributable to the president's actions to release more oil from the strategic reserves. But those prices are still high, even as they've come down.
So then, again, the question, which is the most important statistic? And I mean, is it the high record inflation, or is it those really good unemployment figures that you're saying, very low, 3.6%?
So
why does one, matter more to the people, apparently?
Now, another great question. And the way I think of it is this. I'm an economist here at the White House, and I cannot track one variable. If all I did was report on inflation, I would be completely misrepresenting what's going on in the economy. And economies are complex systems. They can have multiple headwinds and tailwinds going on at the same time, which this one does. We have very strong demand, say, for labor, which is another way of saying lots of job openings, lots of quality job openings. At the same time, we have constraints in our supply system, largely related to the pandemic and some of its enduring problems that it has that are still brought to bear today. And as those two coexist, people see inflation all the time. You drive down the street, you see it at the pump. Now, by the way, one thing you also see at the pump is that prices are down thus far in April by about 7%, about 25 cents a gallon, and that's helpful, and that's partly due to the president's actions regarding release of oil from the strategic reserves. So you can't evaluate this economy on one variable, on inflation alone. You also have to look at the opportunities in the job market, household balance sheets, lower child poverty, the fact that evictions were significantly arrested by the rescue plan. And I think if you take that full picture, it's really important to try to think about where people would be without that strong economic backdrop right now. We are much well prepared to face these headwinds than would otherwise be the case.
Okay, so here's the real big question, apart from, well, the bottom line is the president has basically framed the sanctions on Russia, the help to Ukraine, as a necessary war effort to preserve our, quote, way of life, to preserve democracy, and that's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. When we try to figure out whether he's going to keep, and you all going to keep up these tough measures against Russia, despite the pain it's causing, do you think he's bringing the American people along enough on that issue? Will the political will remain to defeat, as everybody says, Putin must be defeated, or this plan must be defeated, his plan in Ukraine?
The answer to that question is a firm yes. Not only is the political will there, it is extremely strong in this president. I think you hear the passion in the words that you played at the beginning of this segment, but it is a political will, something kind of rare these days, that crosses the aisle. It's bipartisan. If you look at polls, the American people broadly support at quite high levels these kinds of interventions because they recognize that, and the president has been clear about this, we're going to do everything we can to try to insulate households from some of the pain and pressure, particularly around commodity prices, energy, we've talked about food, from this conflict. But we cannot 100% insulate everyone. There have been and will be pressures coming from that, and the American people, I think, at least if you read the polling data, seem clear that they're, not only do we have the political will here, but I think they have the kind of the fairness, the spiritual will to pursue these actions against the horrific facts on the ground that we're learning about in Ukraine.
Let me just also frame that, because again, it really takes you know, a strong sort of spine to continue this. Look at the situation in France. Marine Le Pen, the far-right candidate, has got herself within striking distance of the French president. It's the first time that party has done that, and all because of cost of living issues. She's not talked about immigration. She's not talked about all those dog whistles as she normally does. It's all about cost of living. That's her campaign. Are you concerned about that?
We are certainly concerned about the challenges that households face from these budgetary pressures. And you heard the president say that specifically in the comments you played earlier. I think the most important thing that we can do here is twofold. One, express to the people with the passion and conviction of this president how deeply important and existential the fight in support of Ukraine is. And I think that he's been extremely convincing, and the polls suggest that Americans agree with him. In fact, it's even a bipartisan view here. Secondly, to make sure that families know that we are fighting to do the best we can to insulate them from these inflationary pressures on their household budgets. The release of 180 million barrels of oil from the strategic reserves. The president, by the way, worked with partners in Europe and other advanced economies to kick that 180 up to 240 million barrels. Yesterday, he announced a plan for cheaper gasoline, particularly in the Midwest, and these are having an effect. The price at the pump is down about a quarter, according to AAA retail gas numbers. We see goods getting through the port. We see our shelves amply stocked. Our actions are helping. If we were simply saying to the American people, yeah, there's a lot of inflation out there, but there's a conflict and, you know, let's see what happens, that would be a different story. That's not at all the story we're telling. We are dispatched from this president to relentlessly fight on behalf of American families and their household budgets.
One of the things that motivates the American people, and it shows up in elections these days, and also the president, was this commitment to climate. It's a big deal in the US and around the world. So many are asking, you know, why not use this opportunity instead of pumping more oil and lowering prices, or to lower prices, which I understand what you're doing. But why not take this opportunity to actually double down on the, you know, renewables and use that to sort of, you know, insulate you all for the future?
It's a fair question, and the answer is that we have to do both. This is not an either or. This is not either we pump or we go renewable. This is a both and. This is a walk and chew gum moment. I think I've run out of metaphors, but I think you know what I mean. We've got to do both, and the reason we have to do both is we must make sure that we bring people along with us. You know, you've heard, and you yourself were citing poll numbers suggesting that these elevated prices are a stressor to family budgets, and that's something the president talks about every time he talks about the economy. He remembers his own family going through those kinds of pressures, and he tells you about it. So I think that kind of empathy is well understood by working Americans, and we have to make sure that as we transition to a more renewable and green economy, people understand that both of these paths are essential. Now, the question, I think, is, do we have a robust, effective plan to get down that path, to make that transition? Electric vehicles, tax credits to support solar and wind, hydrogen. In fact, if you look at our green agenda, it's very deep, and we continue to fight legislatively to set that path and to both help folks at the pump today, but free ourselves from the dependence on autocratic and vicious plutocrats at the same time through our pursuit of clean energy goals.
As you said, there's a lot on your plate, but it's the stakes are very high. Jared Bernstein, thank you so much for joining us. And as we said, President Biden has accused Vladimir Putin of genocide. He later elaborated, saying, "We'll let the lawyers decide internationally whether or not it qualifies." But the United States is limited in helping the investigation, as it does not recognize the International Criminal Court. I asked Ben Ferenc, he's the last surviving Nuremberg trials prosecutor, if the United States should sign up.
Absolutely. Absolutely should be in the lead, as we were in so many things, and taking a sensible position instead of taking, well, do we need it? Are we going to be restrained? Nobody likes to be restrained. All the murderers think they're doing it in the national interest. I regret, and I have only one head to give for my country. Well, to die for your country is not glorious. To live for your country is glorious. And so we have it on backwards. And I don't know how many more people must die before we begin to realize it.
Such passion born of such experience. At 102 years of age, Ferenc has very, very firm views on trials and accountability. And you can see the full interview on our program this Friday. Meantime, ITV News correspondent Dan Rivers went back to Bucha in Ukraine to investigate 3 brutal killings. Here's his report, which we must warn you contains graphic and distressing images. And what he finds is troubling, but it's important to see.
If there is one place in Ukraine which has come to symbolize the barbarity of this war, it is Bucha. The images which emerged from this town gave the world its first glimpse into the terrible consequences of a conflict prosecuted without limits. Today, the drive into Bucha looks very different to those first hours after it was liberated on the 1st of April. This was the first evidence of the crimes perpetrated here. The bodies of civilians left decomposing where they fell. For more than 6 weeks, the world's attention has focused on the horrors unfolding in Ukraine, in particular the town of Bucha to the west of Kyiv. We've investigated 3 separate atrocities in Bucha to give a sense of the widespread, indiscriminate murder being carried out by the Russian army. The first involves a man whose body was found at this mass grave next to St Andrew's Church, where investigators are beginning to uncover the scale of the slaughter in Bucha during the nearly month-long Russian occupation. Volodymyr Stefianko is just one of dozens of relatives looking for answers. The number of bodies buried here is unknown, but it's thought there are at least 115. They were hurriedly interred here by locals. Most were shot on the streets of Bucha. Now each is being carefully recovered for a full forensic examination. We're with Volodymyr as he waits to find out if his brother Dmytro is among the dead. As the face of each is uncovered, suddenly the awful moment of recognition.
Можно я ему закрыть?
Точно він? Точно він?
Больно было на душе сильно. Жалко. Хотелось обнять, закрыть ему глаза, поговорить его. Просто потом слезы, боль. Не знаю, что еще. Ненависть к этим русским.
We accompany him to the place where his brother Dmytro was killed. We find an eyewitness who was there that day and detained moments later by the same group of half a dozen Russian soldiers.
Они побежали в ту сторону, а потом их там подстрелили и сюда притянули его. Ну, а здесь уже стреляли.
Oleg's testimony matches the physical evidence here. We find a 7.62 shell casing from an RPK machine gun on the ground where Dmytro was executed. Bullet holes in the fence match Oleg's description of the shooting. Other neighbours here heard shots at around 10:30 on March the 26th, the day he disappeared.
That's him? Да, только прическа больше была чуть-чуть.
Oleg recognises the photo of Dmytro and confirms he was shot dead here, adding another man who was with Dmytro managed to escape.
На курточке сзади, овальная.
I ask Volodymyr if he feels he got closer to the truth about how his brother died.
Подстрелили сюда.
Да, то есть я уже все получил. Только интересно, когда тот бежал, просил ли мой брат помощи, чтобы помог. Или просто тупо остался лежать, уже что будет, то будет. Брат не всегда может просить помощи, он такой.
Dmytro's murder was just one of possibly hundreds of similar summary executions, but a mile north of the place he died is a children's camp where there's evidence of more organised killing. What you're about to see is a video recorded by the Ukrainian authorities after they first entered the basement of the building used by the Russians. Their hands bound, they appear to have been shot as they knelt on the floor. While the Russian government has accused Ukraine of faking massacres like this, we found several pieces of evidence pointing to Russian responsibility. The children's camp was marked with a V, a symbol used by Russian forces to identify themselves. Russian ration packs litter the entrance to the cellar. But inside, there are more clues. You can see the bullet marks still in the wall here. The angle that the bullets came in is coming down, suggesting the person was standing over there and the victims were down here. There is actually a bullet down here, which is a .545 caliber Kalashnikov bullet with a steel core, which is only issued to the military. We were given access to this cellar because forensic teams have concluded their work. The identities of the men found here have now been established. They were Sergei Mateshko, Vladimir Bochenko, Viktor Prudko, Valery Plukko, and Dmytro Schulmeister. Dmytro's sister says he and 4 others refused to flee, deciding to help others to escape Bucha until the Russians caught them.
Он жил обычной жизнью, находился у себя дома, на своей земле. Пришли звери, варвары, которые отобрали у него жизнь. За что? За что?
2 miles south of the children's camp is the site of another massacre, this time even larger. Outside an agricultural construction agency, the bodies of 8 men were found near these steps to the side of the building. 3 more were found elsewhere on the site. This is the scene which investigators found. This man had his hands bound behind his back and his fingernails removed. One has electrical cable tied around his feet and has been beaten across the back. A military crate with the markings of the 7th Paratroop Unit was found close by. Inside the building was another body on a stairwell. This is where some of the most harrowing images to emerge from Bucha were taken. The police have found 8 bodies here and more inside. They don't know how many people were killed here in total. Forensic officers are continuing to comb this building for clues, but it appears this was some sort of torture center.
Это был штаб, ну и там же и расстреливали, то есть тут проводились фильтрационные, в том числе фильтрационные мероприятия, как, ну если можно так назвать.
By filtration activities, he means selecting which prisoners would be executed. We've identified one of the dead men found here as Anatoly Prihidko, who was born in 1983 and may have been targeted because he was with Ukraine's territorial defence. A witness who saw his body told us his cheek had been cut out, there were multiple stab wounds on his torso, and he'd been shot through the chest.
З приводу розстрілу цих людей, то руки були більшості зв'язані. Тобто це ознаки катування.
One man has spoken to us who saw, heard and survived the massacre. Speaking for the first time, but still too scared to show his identity, he says Russian soldiers were going house to house, rounding up civilians to decide who to execute. He was only spared because he could prove he'd fought in Afghanistan as a Soviet soldier 40 years ago.
Первого парня розстріляли в спину. Потім ще двох розстріляли. Мене поставили далі, потім ще там людей зібрали. Чоловік 10-12 отобрали, биті, футболки натягнуті, руки зв'язані, їх завели в торець. Контору эту поставили, їх там, бо солдат вернувся, зразу, автоматна очередь, солдат вернувся. Солдат вернувся. І вони потім, убиті всі були.
As the war crimes investigation starts, there are of course questions about whether these three cases were part of a wider campaign of orchestrated murder directed by senior leaders in Russia, something I put to Ukraine's Prosecutor General. Was this orchestrated or was this from just rogue units of the Russian army?
Of course, it was ordered to kill civilians because we see gunshots. That's why it's actually, it was order. And what you see here in Bucha and other small cities, small villages which were occupied in Kyiv region, actually you see it's not only war crimes, it's crimes against humanity.
To what extent does President Putin hold responsibility for this?
President Putin is a main war criminal of 21st century. Of course, he is responsible of all of this, what is going on now in Ukraine. But you remember that it was in Chechnya, and what is after Chechnya? It was in Georgia, it was in Syria, and he is still not responsible for all these crimes against humanity. That's why we should do everything to punish people who are responsible for this.
The service to remember the victims of Bucha at St Andrew's Church involves a choir, now a quarter of the size it used to be. One has died, the others have fled, but the Russian occupation hasn't silenced those who remain.
Але простити тих, хто на твоїх очах гвалтував твоїх дітей, дуже важко. І цей шлях довгий, той шлях важкий.
But while survivors search their souls for the strength to forgive, Bucha will never forget what happened here. And neither should we.
ITV's Dan Rivers' important reporting there. President Putin keeps calling all of this fake, and yet the Chancellor of Austria, the first head of state to visit Putin since the war, went to tell him exactly what was going on. And yet he kept Putin saying that it was fake. Now to the extraordinary story of one of America's great civil rights activists. But you probably don't know much about him, for he has a secret that kept him very low profile. Walter White was mixed race, but he passed as a white man, which enabled his investigative work. Now, journalist and author A.J. Brime is telling his story in White Lies, The Double Life of Walter F. White and America's Darkest Secrets. He's joining me from Sacramento, California. Welcome to the program. It is an extraordinary story, so we just have to ask you to lay out for us and for our viewers who haven't read the book or know about him, what is it that allowed him to do so much important work and yet not be known?
Well, the subtitle of the book is called The Double Life of Walter White. So Walter described himself, Walter White, as the enigma of a black man occupying a white body. So he was born into a black family. His parents were among the last who could remember from memory being born into slavery. But Walter had white skin, blonde hair and blue eyes, and he lived a double life his entire life in the service of civil rights. So he could live as a white man, he could live as a black man. He identified as black, and sort of weaponizing his skin color, if you will, he was able to accomplish some amazing things. Now, at the end of Walter White's life, he had a scandal, a controversy that sort of destroyed his reputation, and that's why nobody knows who he is today.
So we'll get to that in a second, but recount for us, AJ Bain, what he actually did. He was formative in the NAACP, but he went out to these places and investigated. What did he do, and how was he able to get to places?
In the first half of this book, it really explores Walter White's life living as an undercover white investigator. So starting in 1918, when he began work with the NAACP, he actually was his 12th day. He read about a murder and torture of a black man in front of 1,500 people in the tiny town of Estill Springs, Tennessee. And Walter had this idea that he could go down. He was a black man. He identified as black, but he knew that he could go down there and pose as a white man, and this was and get the facts. And so he became a crime fighter. This was the first of over 40 investigations, undercover living as a white man in the South, that Walter White conducted from 1918 to 1930. And these were some of the most harrowing crimes in American history. They made sensational headlines and made a star out of Walter White.
And what about the NAACP? You know, when he came along, it was really a fledgling organization.
That's correct. So he was plucked out of obscurity by James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP. James Weldon Johnson was a fascinating figure and really became a mentor to Walter White. So at that time, the NAACP, nobody had really heard of it. If they had, it was probably because the NAACP employed the two greatest black intellectuals of the era. That would be James Weldon Johnson and W.E.B. Du Bois. Walter comes on the scene in 1918 and begins to really earn a name for himself through these undercover investigations. And frankly, I think that's a good reason why we know of the NAACP today, because these investigations created massive wellsprings of support for the NAACP, huge amounts of publicity. And by the time Walter White became chief executive of the NAACP in 1930, was the largest, most militant civil rights organization that had ever existed.
Let me just focus on some of the things that he was transformative in changing. You mentioned his brave, undercover investigation as a white-skinned black man, including to investigate in Tulsa in 1921, the massacre there, the lynchings. And then, recently, President Biden has signed a bill named for Emmett Till, and Vice President Harris said lynchings haven't been confined to history. This is what she said. Let's just play it.
Lynching is not a relic of the past. Racial acts of terror still occur in our nation. And when they do, we must all have the courage to name them and hold the perpetrators to account.
So, we're in the midst of, and we've just been reporting, obviously, about crimes and accountability. And this idea of accountability is so front and center now with the war in Ukraine and the horrors that Russia's committing. And I just wanted to know how Walter White influenced the leaders of his time to come on board with these, whether it's FDR, Harry Truman.
Well, there's two ways to answer that question. For starters, Walter White conducted, as I said, over 40 undercover investigations, posing as a white man for these horrific murders. He was able to find out who the perpetrators were, publicize their names, write memorandums about these crimes to the governors of the states and the Attorney General and the President of the United States, and no one was ever arrested for any of them. And so Walter White and the NAACP went on this maniacal quest throughout the 20s and 30s to create a federal anti-lynching law. So if somebody was murdered in a small town in Tennessee and nothing was done about it, even though everybody knew who the killers were, the federal government could step in. And they fought for generations and decades and never really realized victory in that fight. And that's why the recent federal anti-lynching law signed by Biden is such a momentous occasion. The other way to answer your question is, halfway through the book, White Lies, Walter realizes that his undercover work, his investigations, and the articles he was writing in national magazines was only doing so much. It was making the NAACP famous, but he realized that racism was really systemic, and they didn't use that word at the time. But the second half of the book is really about his life in national politics and becoming a political powerhouse, because he realized the only way to affect change, to bring democracy for real to not just white Americans but black Americans, was voting power and the Oval Office.
And then tragically, I don't know whether you agree that it's tragic, but it seems to be that he divorced his wife, who was black, and he had been in love for a number of years with a white woman who he eventually married. And that just caused a scandal that obliterated his contribution and his historic position in American society.
That's absolutely correct. I think when people will read the book, you will agree with me that I don't think there's any doubt that Walter Francis White was the most influential civil rights leader of the first half of the 20th century. And you're saying, how can that be true? Nobody's ever heard of him, and there's really two reasons. One is, at the end of his life, he endured this shocking scandal because he identified as a black man. He really was the face of black power in America. Very ironic, given the fact that he had blonde hair and blue eyes, but he identified as black. He was born into a black family. Late in life, he ended up leaving his black wife for a white woman, and the scandal was just apocalyptic in his life. And this happened shortly before his death, and I think that he had been conducting this affair secretly, trying to keep it a secret because he knew what it would do to his reputation, and it did destroy him. The other reason why people don't know about him today is right when he died, Martin Luther King Jr. comes on the scene, Montgomery bus boycott. The new generation of civil rights leader really, they weren't interested in having a man with white skin and blue eyes be the face of their movement, especially in the new age of television. So Walter White's legacy quickly disappeared.
It's really a remarkable story. AJ Bain, thank you for bringing it to us. White Lies, it's really an incredible story. Thanks a lot. Now, the Ukrainian president today addressed his 26th foreign government since the war began. That was Estonia. And The Economist editor-in-chief Zanny Minton-Beddoes recently met Zelensky to discuss the world's response to Putin's war. Now, back from Kyiv, she spoke to Walter Isaacson about it.
Thank you, Christian and Zanny Minton-Beddoes. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You had an amazing interview with President Zelensky. You went to Kyiv. He said some amazing things for The Economist. But first of all, tell me what it was like to get there. What was it like to go to his office? How did you get there?
Well, I got to Kiev. I flew to Warsaw, then took a car to the border and across the border to Lviv, that city in western Ukraine where all the refugees are coming through. And then took the overnight train from Lviv to Kiev, which was quite an experience. And actually, the first time, Walter, that I really felt that I was in a country at war was at Lviv station, where we arrived late at night. The lights were dimmed. It was full of people, absolutely full of people, soldiers, but also huge numbers of refugees, tired. We went past the anti-tank traps, the barriers, up to a big metal gate. Then we had to leave all of our pens, phones, everything behind, so that nothing that could possibly give away the location, up, down corridors. And then eventually we ended up in the room that you will have recognized, which is the room from which President Zelensky addresses, parliaments around the world. It looks a little actually like a corporate meeting room when you're there, with a big Formica white table and office chairs. But we were waiting there, and then suddenly there was a little kerfuffle. Some men with guns came, and he walked in, and we spent over an hour with him. And it was the most